We learned about the context API, and this way of using it is perfectly fine, but there is a more elegant way for using it in class-based components, and of course, there also is an alternative way for using it in functional components. So let's have a look at these two alternative ways now. Now let's start in a person component, which is a class-based component. In class-based components, and only there, you can use an alternative pattern to using that off-context consumer that gets this function. Because not only is this code a bit verbose and can be tricky to wrap your head around when you see it the first time, it also only gives you access to the context in your JSX code here, where you render off-context consumer. Now, what if you wanted to have access to it in component did mount? Because here you also need the authentication status, because you're maybe sending an HTTP request that needs the user ID. Well, then you would have no chance to access the context in component did mount when injecting or when using the context like this. Thankfully, React 16.6 added another way of using context. You can add a special static property named contextType. Now, this has to be named contextType, written exactly like this, and it has to be a static property. Static property means that it can be accessed from outside without the need to instantiate an object based on this class first. And React will access contextType for you, so to say. Now we set a value here, and that value should be your off-context, just like this. Not as JSX code, nothing else, just the off-context object. Now this allows React to automatically connect this component here, this class-based component, to your context behind the scenes. And it gives you a new property in this component, this context property. We can now console log this context here. And again, this context, it has to be written like this because this is given to you by React automatically. And there we can access login, for example, or authenticated, which was our context property holding true or false. This allows us to get access to our context even in places like component did mount where we previously couldn't. And you can of course also use this context in your render function. So instead of using off-context consumer here, you can get rid of that like this and like this. And instead wrap this here with curly braces because we have some JavaScript code here, not just JSX. And now here it's this context, referring to this context property React gives you. And if you now save that, you see in your console log false here 3 times because we have 3 persons, and that is your authentication context being logged. And you see please login is shown because we're not authenticated. And for press login, this changes because this works entirely as before, but now with this more convenient static context type. Now this can be used in class-based components, and I recommend using it there because it's shorter, it's easier in my opinion, and it gives you access to context in places where you previously had no access. In functional components, this is not available. So there we right now only can use off-context consumer because you can't set up a static property here. Thankfully, React has you covered with hooks. You can import the useContext hook. And this now allows you to get access to your context anywhere in your functional component function body. Like here. There I could have my off context, and you can name this whatever you want. And you simply use context like this. And as an argument, you of course pass your off context object. And here again, React will make the connection for you behind the scenes. So now off context will be a constant that holds information about your off context data. So here we can console log off context authenticated, for example, and we can of course also use that in our JSX code down there. So let's get rid of off context consumer and of that function syntax and just output the JSX code for the button. And here instead of context, we now use off context. So this constant I just created. And now with that saved, if I press login, it still works as before, now using the useContext hook. So useContext is to functional components what static context type is to class-based components, you could say. It gives you access to the context, and the context API, is all about managing data across components without the need to pass data around with props. We'll also learn a different concept that helps us with this, Redux, later in the course, and we'll use Redux later in the course. But knowing the context API is important because you can build exciting things with that. And it will also make it easier to understand that Redux thing later once we dive into that.